Well, all right. Well, why don't we begin? This is our last panel of the day's program on friendshoring and what does it mean in the age of Trump 2.0. I'm Andy Grotto. In addition to organizing the conference, I'm also the moderator for this panel. So it's a pleasure to join the stage with these three very distinguished experts. We have Kazuto Suzuki, who, for those of you who weren't in our earlier program, he's a repeat player, which we're very happy about. Suzuki-san is a professor at the University of Tokyo and leads the Institute of Geoeconomics. Chung-Min is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also with the Institute for Strategic International Studies. And then Jane Mellsop is from the Asia Society Policy Institute. Three fantastic experienced experts talk about a topic that I find the phrase friendshoring to have a little bit of a Rorschach test-like quality to it. And so I want to maybe begin with a question for each of you based on your own experience, your outlook on Japan, Korea, the region more broadly. What does friendshoring mean? And what is a friend?
Right. So start with me.
Start
right?
with you, yeah,
okay.
Go for it.
Well, first of all, I have to apologize that I have to leave at 4:30. I came in this morning and I have to leave to Beijing afterwards, so I have a plane to catch. The friendshoring is a very contested word, but I think from a Japanese point of view, it is how trustable or trustworthy the partners are. And the friend does not necessarily mean that it is a security friend. So allies, the security partners does not necessarily constitute as the friend, but it is indeed a very important because this is a question of economic security. So it is the question of those who share the same threats. So those who are having sharing the same threats, for example, those who are exposed to the vulnerabilities of, let's say, the rare earth mineral, is the friends. So there is an incentive to work together to secure supply chain outside of the dominance of the Chinese supply chain of the rare earth. So finding the alternative routes of the supply of the rare earth is a friend because we are sharing the same interest of meeting with this challenge. So I think the friendshoring is, generally speaking, is the countries, the trading with the countries where you are sharing the same threats and sharing the same vulnerability, and those who are trustworthy, which means that there will be much stable regulations, tariffs, and many other trade policies, the more stable trade policies. Mm-hmm. So probably, of course, concerning the rare earth mineral, Japan and the United States is a friend, but at the same time, United States has the unpredictability of the trade policy, which discounts some of those trust of that. So I think it will be perfect if the United States have this stable and rule-based regulations and the predictable trade policy. But so far, it is the question of security. I think Japan and the United States are friends, and many other countries, including Australia, Canada, Singapore. There are a number of countries, which does not necessarily mean that for example, Singapore is not exactly the military allies, but we do share a lot of concerns about maintaining the free trade agreement or free trade policies. So that constitutes the important relationship in terms of the economic security. Right. So those are probably the definition of that.
Chung-Min, any major differences you see in how Korea thinks about?
Well, first of all, Andy, thank you so much for having me here, and to all of your great staff who have made this possible. I don't know why I'm on this panel, because I'm not an economist, never pretended to be, but yet
I'm a lawyer.
I guess Andy thought that he would
scientist.
pinch me in between two really great trade and econ specialists. But from where I sit, as I focus primarily on defense, innovation, and technologies, I was talking to a senior American policymaker several years ago, and he asked me, why is Japan so vocal about their anti-Chinese stance and the South Koreans are so silent? So I said, well, I don't know the real reason, but I'll ask you one question. Do you know how many times Japan has been invaded by China? So he said, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 times. I said, 0. I said, do you know how many times Korea has been invaded by China or somebody who ruled China? And he said, well, I don't know, 10, 20 times. I said, about 900 times. So we don't have to vocalize the fact that we're concerned about China. We are stuck with China, whether we like it or not. And that, I think, is the paradigm that defines how we see friendship. For 3,000 years, Andy, we thought that China was our primary friend. For the last 50, 70 years, it's America that's our primary friend. And so I told this American official, our foreign policy is very clear. We are consistently inconsistent vis-a-vis the US and China. No country, Australia, Taiwan, Japan even, you cannot have a consistent policy that satisfies both Washington and Beijing. But I think we're at this very pivotal moment in history whereby Korean companies now realize that our future lies in friendshoring. So we had that huge hiccup in Georgia, unfortunately. But overall, if you're investing, last year combined, the Koreans invested $64 billion in the US. And plans are to invest at least $100 billion more. That's not a small chunk of change. And so for Korean firms, as you reduce your dependency on the Chinese market, up to 25% of Korean exports headed to China, but now it's 18%. So as we not decouple, but de-risk from the mainland China, our companies realize that our future lies in the US. So reshoring is a net positive for the Koreans. We may have difficulties on tariffs or with Trump's other types of policies, but Korean companies have made the pivot and they're in the US for good.
Great. Jane, you're director for trade, investment, and economic security at the Asia Society. So you have sort of a regional-wide perspective, but you also served as senior trade advisor for the top trade negotiator in New Zealand. So you also bring a practitioner's perspective from a country with a smaller economy. I'd love for you to share a perspective, both your observations region-wide, and then if you could go back to your days as a trade advisor, what this concept meant within New Zealand.
Great, thanks. And just to echo my colleagues here, thanks very much for having me today. Great to be a part of this discussion. So I think just drawing on some of the comments that the others have made, when I'm thinking about friendshoring, I'm really thinking about cooperation. And I think that is a word that means different things, though, to different countries, to different people, and what is the level of that cooperation? So on the one end, you might have, for example, comprehensive free trade agreements where you're having really a lot of cooperation, you're making legally binding commitments to each other. And then at the other end, it might be something that is just a joint statement agreed between leaders, or as we're seeing now with President Trump's approach, it's not even written down sometimes, but there is a level of cooperation out there. So I think that friendshoring, it's not easy to sort of pigeonhole it. It can have a wide variety of elements to it. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is I think that certainty is also one of the really important elements of friendshoring. And so What that means is that then what governments are hopefully trying to do all the time is to make it easier for their businesses to trade, to bring greater economic growth to their countries. And so what businesses are really after is certainty in order to make those business decisions. So I think one of the great things about friendshoring, if it's done well, is that it does provide that certainty for businesses, and that allows, therefore, for good investment decisions to be made, and therefore greater economic growth. Just turning to your other question about what it means for a small country like New Zealand, obviously in a very different position than the US, and obviously smaller than Japan and Korea as well. I think, though, the similarities that I would draw between them is really that outward-looking approach. And I think diversification is a word that we hear a lot now, and I think that has become a little bit stronger this year after some of the actions from the Trump administration, that really countries are emphasizing the importance of reaching out to a wide range of partners. And that then comes back to, well, do we need to be friends? What does it mean to be friends? Who are we actually going to reach out to? And how are we going to prioritize that? Recently, when I was in the region and talking to people about this, one of the things that came up was also countries only have a limited amount of resources. So when they are thinking about who they want to engage with, where do they want to go next for the economic integration, it'd be great if we could do everything all at once. But the reality is we need to diversify, but we also have to prioritize, and we can't do everything. So I think that's just an important thing to remember, especially for smaller countries like New Zealand. They have to really assess, where are the benefits, what should they be doing first, but also taking a long-term approach, where that's possible. And one of the things that New Zealand has done with countries like Singapore is tried to position themselves as kind of a leader of new initiatives and taking a very long-term approach, so that it might start off as a couple of small countries doing something, but the idea is that other countries will join on later with this initiative, and it will grow in importance as well.
That's great. For me at least, what I always come back to with this idea of friendshoring is the notion that friends are those who don't use leverage over the supply chain to extract concessions, which is a little bit different than what I'm hearing from you three. And I think maybe it has something to do, and maybe we can pull this thread a little bit. In the United States, certainly since the 1990s, the sort of the strategic culture drew a sharp distinction between trade policy on the one hand and security policy on the other hand. Now, there's some overlap. More trade, in theory, brings countries together. But in terms of policy, particularly in areas like export controls, CFIUS, the foreign investment, national security screening process in the United States, were very clearly separated from trade considerations. That's changed in recent years, and I think if you take as an example President Trump's reversal of the ban on exports of the H-20 chip to China, very much rooted in the tariff negotiations with China, not in national security, right? Because those controls were put in place originally for national security purposes. And I'm curious to hear from you three how, in the discourse that you're part of. How do trade and security cross paths? How do those? Is it a balancing act? Is it no, security is sacrosanct? We don't trade security for economics. Love to hear you all reflect on that.
Well, I think there's no longer the distinction between the trade and security anymore. I think the idea of separating trade and security were generally started with the idea of the free trade. And the free trade started from 1940s after World War II. And I think there was a clear distinction. And the GATT 21 is basically assuming that the security is separated. So the export control, the CFIUS, all these the matter of security concerns can be exempted from the trade policy, and the general trade policy is supposed to be the free trade. But the concept of free trade is no longer applicable in the trade policy these days. I mean, since Trump stopped appointing the appellate body of the WTO, the free trade rules, no matter how you brutally violate the WTO rules, you will never be punished. So at the end of the day, you cannot you cannot assume that the world is based on the free trade principles. So now it is, and we are trapped in the world of interdependence. Interdependence means that if you are connected all together in the global supply chain, there is always the division of labor. And if there is a division of labor, there are always vulnerabilities because you are not doing everything in onshoring. So you are offshoring some of the industry to outside the country. And that creates the vulnerability. But in the, if the free trade rules are applied, then you don't have to worry, if it's China or whoever that you trade. But if your trade and investment are protected by the rules, this wouldn't matter. But now, the China is using the export control, the United States using the tariffs. All these rules dictating the international trade is no longer available, and it is the states are now using these leverage as the power to negotiate and to influence the policies of others. So we are living in the time of the geoeconomic power game or geoeconomic power balance. If you have the indispensability, like rare earth in China, then you use it to exercise your power against others. And that is like, the trade is now being used as a weapon. And this, the more you have the concentration of the production, such as the rare earth mineral in China, you have more leverage and you have more power against others. And this is what happened in the tariff negotiation between the United States and China. And unfortunately, the United States is losing out because the China has much more bigger leverage than the United States.
Andy, if I think about this issue, we're living in an era of the weaponization of everything, whether it's geopolitical, geoeconomic, or technology. I'd like to make 3 quick points. The first is we are now seeing for the first time the merging of the political, free market, and military markets. And they all used to have different goals as well as assets and capabilities. And yet, as we saw from the THAAD dispute, when the North Koreans tested their nuclear weapons in 2016, then President Park said, okay, we're going to have the theater high altitude area missile defense. The Chinese got very upset, and then they imposed economic sanctions on the Koreans. So that was a wake-up call, because for the first time, we took a security decision, and there was blowback economically big time. The second huge wake-up call was under the second Trump administration, because they didn't really care about the FTA. So we signed the Chorus FTA, which we thought was a very big shift towards free trade with America and others. But when the second Trump presidency began, Chorus FTA or other FTAs were basically shoved aside. And we had to basically begin from scratch. So Koreans now have to learn a new language. You have to merge markets that are security, military, and technology, and combine that into one, so that the real core currency, in my view, is trust. Trust is the Bitcoin going forward in this new market. The second point is, whether you talk about security or resilience or deterrence, we are now living in a culture where you have to deal with everything at the same time. but your bandwidth, as Jane said, is limited. So what do? For those of you who are Korean foodies, bibimbap. It's basically a mixed rice vegetable bowl where everything is mixed and then you just basically turn it around. And Koreans are used to this bibimbap mentality. So I think for the first time, it's a big test for Korean governments. Everybody, even non-economists in the cabinet, must understand economy and technology. And that means that from the National Security Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and everybody else with key portfolios, they must really understand economics and technology going forward. My final point is, for the longest time, progressives in South Korea, didn't really have a good relationship with chaebols, or these large family-owned entities, these large conglomerates. If you saw the APEC 25 summit meeting in Gyeongju, President Lee highlighted his relationship with all the chaebols, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Hanwha, and the list goes on. Without Korean companies, you have no leverage outside of Korea. And that, I think, is one of the biggest game changers and mind shifts within the Korean political world that I think is here to stay.
Great. I've got a legal background, so I'm coming at this question slightly differently, just from the sort of legal thinking and sort of coming back to what I said a bit earlier about writing things down. There's always been a national security exception. It was in the WTO agreements, and it's always at the back of every free trade agreement as well. So in a way, there was always an element of linking national security with trade that was there. But there was also an understanding, perhaps this bit wasn't written down, that actually, national security exceptions were really not used very often. Countries wouldn't rely on that exception. They wouldn't take measures all the time relying on that exception and undoing the commitments that were either in the WTO or in their free trade agreement. But what we're seeing now is that actually countries are willing to use, or some countries, maybe more than others, are willing to use a much broader interpretation of national security. And really we're seeing a morphing, I think, of economic security and national security. And we see that statement quite often, that economic security is national security. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing now is, I guess, a bit of an eroding of the commitments that have been made, whether they're in free trade agreements or in WTO agreements, where countries are able to use economic security in order to undo what's sort of previously been free and open trade. And I just wanted to mention one example of this that was just concluded recently when President Trump was in his Asia tour just last week. Feels like I can't remember what day it is. So much happens every day now. It's hard to remember what day everything happened. But I'll just use the Malaysia example there was also the Cambodia example, but the fact that the US is now very explicitly including economic security provisions in what would traditionally, be thinking of trade agreements that have provisions about tariffs and services and technical barriers to trade and things like that. There's now really specific economic security provisions, and I think that is something that has really seen the merging of security, with trade. So in the Malaysia example, a couple of things that are interesting about that, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people who will study that agreement in slower time and come up with lots of comments, but a few things that sort of jumped out to me. One was that the economic security provisions in there are one-sided. There's not a requirement for Malaysia to apply customs duties. There's not a requirement for the US to apply customs duties if Malaysia has decided to apply customs duties for national security reasons. There's not a requirement for the US to align its export control regime, with Malaysia. So it's also interesting to see how that discussion has ended up, very much going down one route. There's also provisions in there that look at what third countries are doing in Malaysia as well. So bringing in that concept of Chinese content, Chinese investment, Chinese ownership. What does that actually mean for those countries? I think it's really putting it pretty starkly there when it's written down in the agreement that where the US is concerned about what's happening as a result of that Chinese investment in Malaysia, then they will be requiring Malaysia to take particular action. So I think that's been talked about for some time, and it's obviously been a concern for the US, and for other countries for some time. But it feels like this is the first time when it's really being sort of written down in black and white. And I guess what that also shows to me is not only the priority that this is sort of really illustrating that this is for the US, but what does it mean for other countries now? Is this a template that the US is now going to be putting forward? Is it going to take that up with Japan? Is it going to take that up with Korea, or if it's Five Eyes partners or others, and making those expectations? Got the review of the USMCA agreement. It's another good example where perhaps those provisions will be slotted in there as well. So I think that sort of merging of national security, economic security and trade, I feel is definitely on the table now.
Good.
I just wanted to comment on what Jane said about Japan. Japan has already made, before the US-Malaysian agreement on the economic security, Japan has made the MOU on the investment in accordance to the implementation of the tariff deal. And that was basically the economic security deal. The 9 domains which are defined as an area of investment from Japan to United States is basically for the security, for the economic security and building up a resilience for the supply chain. Also, the United States has concluded the agreement on the rare earth mineral with Australia. So that was also another aspect of of what I've said about the United States recognizing its weakness and the vulnerability of being exploited by China, and to build up the sort of a teamwork of building the supply, alternative supply chain of the rare earth mineral. So I think, and Japan and US MOU were basically focusing on the energy security and the semiconductor and all those areas where the United States do not have enough to secure its supply chain, and the United States tried to reshore those industrial capabilities back in the United States, onshoring, reshoring, so that to build more resilience and autonomy against China. So I think all these, today, all the trade agreements, investment agreements, everything else is somewhat related or mainly focused on the economic security. So I think this is, as Chung-Min said, it's all game changed. And I think the Japanese game change started from 2010 when China stopped exporting the rare earth mineral to Japan. So I think it is we are already recognizing that this is trade and the security are already meshed up in quite detail.
Well, I think that the phrase economic security entered the Japanese policy kind of mainstream. Was probably the first country I would suggest. I'm curious, all three of you, what is your assessment of how Japan has navigated the tariffs, the demands to purchase U.S. goods, and the reshoring demands of the Trump administration? You laid out an economic security arrangement between Japan and the United States. A cynic might say, well, it's economic security for the United States, but what's in it for Japan? I'd love to hear your assessment.
Well, this is coming back to the question of the friendshoring. I think, this investment is not just simply about reshoring to the United States, but it is an investment from Japan. It is the Japanese companies involving in building up of the resilience of the United States, which eventually means that it will be the Japanese experience, Japanese access to the technology, and all these, combining the U.S. and the Japanese expertise on a certain product such as a semiconductor will enhance the economic security of Japan. So we see this as this is an opportunity for building up the much stronger resilience against external threat, especially from China, and to maintain the competitiveness, especially the high-end chips, to be maintain the superiority against the Chinese chip makers.
So the strategic logic is different than it was in the late 80s, early 1990s, when the Japanese car industry began to make massive investments in the U.S. market, primarily for trade reasons. But this is much more explicitly geopolitical.
Exactly. I think the big difference between the 1980s is that in 1980s it was the question of Ford, Chrysler, or GM losing its capabilities, losing their orders, their employments, and it is primarily protecting the American industry, American companies. But now the investment of Japanese companies with Japanese money in United States means that it's not about protecting the American companies. It is combining the Japanese companies, Japanese expertise, and the U.S. expertise together, and to build up. It doesn't necessarily be in an American company. It's a joint venture. It may be a Toyota or Honda. It doesn't matter. And I think the Trump administration, second Trump administration's policy to invite more investment means that if there is a competition, there will be a competition in the United States about the Toyota and the Ford. But if the Ford loses out, but that can be acceptable, because what is the most important for the United States is to bring the industry back, not the American company back. So I think this is a different mindset of the 1980s.
If you look at what the Koreans did, once President Trump came back for a second term, they came up with this catchy phrase, some of you know, called MASCA, Make American Shipping Great Again. And some people said, well, that's a bit too far, right? And then in the Gyeongju APEC summit, one of the presents that President Lee gave President Trump was a replica of the gold crown. So obviously we got a lot of repercussions from late night US TV. But on a more serious vein, if you look at what MASCA purports to do, Andy, it really does harp on the critical advantage South Korea has with our Japanese friends as well on shipping. So as US shipping tanked literally in the 80s, 90s, and beyond, the two countries, two of the most closest US allies in Asia, happen to have the world's leading technologies on shipbuilding. So if you include Japanese propeller making, radar, sonar technologies, and so forth, this is a huge boom for the US, because without Korean and Japanese shipbuilding expertise and so forth, the US Navy and for example, other naval capabilities will not be totally gone, but they won't be able to ramp up at the speed that you require this. So that's one of the key things that the Koreans are now really aware of, that friendshoring is not just about setting up a EV or battery factory in Georgia or Alabama or elsewhere. It's making sure that if the Philly shipyard is retrofitted to make sure that we will be able to help America build ships down the road, that is a long-term security commitment. And these projects take 10, 20, 30 years to complete. So when Korea commits to MASCA, it's not just because of President Trump. It's a 30-year deal that we have to basically invest in consistently, both by this government in Korea and whoever replaces President Lee in 5 years' time.
I'll just add two kind of quick points there. One thing that I thought was quite interesting, and a few people have commented on this as well, is that when President Trump first announced these reciprocal tariffs, there was quite a lot of talk about who would retaliate, how would countries actually respond to this. And in actual fact, the only one who ended up really retaliating, was China. Canada did a bit, and obviously the EU sort of went down a path but didn't end up doing it. But I guess it was sort of an interesting thinking because some countries have more power than others, and I guess it gets back to this point that Suzuki-san was making, was that it depends on how much leverage you have, and we know that China has power in rare earths. But what was it that stopped those countries from banding together and thinking maybe if we don't have power on our own, but perhaps if we all got together and made some sort of démarche to the US that this sort of behaviour went against all the various trade rules, etc., etc., maybe there would be some way of moving forward. But in fact, that didn't happen. And countries, in the end, just looked after their own self-interest. And I think it just sort of brought home again, a little bit like it did in COVID, that actually when countries are sort of facing a threat, they really just need to look after themselves.
It's a great point. Just to add, during the WTO negotiations and the earlier rounds, there were trade coalitions, right? Like-minded countries would band together. I mean, New Zealand was involved in several of these, right?
Yeah.
And press their case to the broader body. But just point out, this is different. Why? What's driving this change?
Yeah, I mean, I think countries were. I think they had to sort of really quickly act. That was one thing that is maybe a bit different to a kind of where you're foreseeing negotiations like you are at the WTO or something where there's like a process set out and it's more kind of traditional. I think the speed that countries had to work at was something that was really impactful in this case. We do know that, for example, Malaysia, as the chair of ASEAN, had made some efforts to bring ASEAN trade ministers together really quickly and to try and sort of say, hey, we should, try and tackle this as a group, ASEAN unity and those sort of principles. But then that fell away really quickly when they sort of found out that the first country had broken off and was, going and doing their own thing. So I think that part of it was the speed, and another thing was the people were affected in different ways, and they also had, so for example, maybe Japan and Korea, for example, with autos, was really prominent for them. Some countries were really big on the rules-based trading system and just we're talking about we've got to do this because we've got to save the rules-based trading system.
Principle.
Exactly, a principled approach, whereas others were much more on the practical side of of counting the impact. And we know that for some countries, it's huge amounts of money. Other countries thought better just to go under the radar. Maybe just try not to sort of, talk to the US, maybe not engage with them. Maybe that's a better way. Maybe President Trump might have forgotten where your country is, or or how much your trade deficit is, or something like that. So I think there were different strategies that countries were wanting to embark on as well. And for smaller countries, it was just also the reality, I think, of what they were facing. So. What's the benefit of retaliating is also, something that people were thinking of. Why didn't Korea, for example, take a dispute settlement case? They had to sort of think about that. Well, what's going to be the benefit of that? So for small countries, what's the benefit of retaliating and putting tariffs on and just making goods more expensive for your own people? That's not going to work either.
And just quickly, I think for Koreans, companies are now in the front line. They're the biggest actors in the trade or tariff disputes.
Yep.
So at the APEC meeting, for example, the chairman of Hyundai Motors told President Lee in one of the meetings that, thank you, Mr. President, for bringing down the tariffs, auto tariffs from 25 to 15%, so I owe you big time. And the reason he said that was because for Korean automakers, the third largest in the world, 25 to 15% tariffs on your cars, that is a huge difference on your profit margin, right? But again, these companies are the ones who are in the forefront, making decisions, taking the hits, so that the government does help these companies, but it's the companies who are the ones who are actually doing all of the heavy lifting. And I think what's happening right beneath the radar is you don't want to upset the Trump administration for a number of reasons. So these countries, whether it's South Korea, Australia, Canada, the EU, and Japan, they're all trying to basically make kind of informal economic and trade relationships that are basically government to government, but more so company to company. And I think that's going to be the role model going forward, so that you want to shield yourself from whatever the U.S. may or may not do, but you're also making sure that you compete heavily under the radar. For example, Koreans are vying for a huge submarine deal with our Canadian friends, and so are the Germans and Norwegians. But if the Korean consortium gets that submarine deal, it's a 12 submarine deal worth literally $20–30 billion. That will be a huge shift because despite the U.S. having problems with Canada and vice versa, Korea and Japan want very close economic ties with the Canadians.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts, and maybe Kazuto, you'll weigh in as well. Japan and Korea have different business-government relations. Very different, right? The chaebols have a different relationship with the Korean government than large industries do in Japan. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand how those dynamics shape the respective roles of government and industry in these kind of, in this intersection of economic and national security.
Right. I think Jimmy's right that the companies are in the front line of the economic security. They are the ones that soldiering out and taking the first hit by any economic sanctions or the export control, tariffs, everything. So it is the matter of the democratic system within the country that how companies' pain will be translated into policy. And I think in case of Korea, this translation is much easier because of the chaebol and the very, consolidated number of the, economic actors just, speaking to the president. Whereas in Japan, it's parliamentary system as well as the, it's more diversified, economic interest. Even in, shipbuilding, there are, several companies there. So I think in case of Japan, I think the communication between the government and the industry are not as easy as South Korea. So therefore, the sort of the industrial groups such as the SJAC, the Society of Japanese Aerospace Companies, or the Japanese automobile companies, JAC, or there are a number of these industrial groupings which summarize all these the demands from the industry to speak to the government. But I think still there are very limited channels of the communication between the industry and the government. So it is the government which plans and leads the industrial policy. So this is what happened in the 1980s or before 1980s, and which was criticized by the United States that this was an unfair trade practice because the Japanese government is combining. So Japan Inc. was the typical the caricatured image of Japan that the government leads the industry. But because of this industrial structure of this diversified the economic interest of the different sectors and the different companies, the governments tend to have a much more stronger leadership, and the MITI by then it takes a stronger leading role to design and plan the industrial policy. The problem today is that it's not as straightforward as it used to be. In the 1960s and 70s, it was pretty much a catching up. So the government, METI guys, understood where to go, because there are always the predecessors, catching up with the United States, Europe, or even, some technologies in Soviet Union. So those were the time that, Japan was the sort of a latecomers, catching up, backwarded country. But today, we don't have that, role models in front of us. So what we are doing is trying to find out what is the appropriate measures to meet the challenges of the economic security while developing the industrial policy. So that's why the Takaichi government is now setting up the Japan economic growth strategy, and I'm happen to be the member of the expert community of building up this growth strategy. And I think the government is increasingly use people like me as an advisor to think of what is the goal and to how to lead the industry.
Thank you.
Andy, until 1981 or 2, South Korea had 5-year economic plans. And under the 5-year economic plan, the corporations were always under the bureaucracy. So whether it was an economic planning board or any other Ministry of Finance or technology, for example, chaebols and other companies were quote-unquote subservient to the state. That has changed. Not completely, but it has changed enormously. I'll just give you one example. Every 5 years we have elections in South Korea. There's talk about redoing the constitution to the American style. But regardless, every 5 years you have a new government. And depending on whether it's progressive or conservative, chaebols were either really, really, really upset or uptight and waiting for the new government to enact higher corporate taxes or whatever, or you had a much more business-friendly government. So that left-right dichotomy existed, but I think because of the global supply chain wars, that has changed. South Korea simply doesn't have the wherewithal to say, oh, we can be pro-business on Monday and pro-labor on Tuesday, raise taxes on Wednesday, and Thursday we want you to invest more money in the US. That's not possible, right? So therefore, what Korean companies have done is, by virtue of the changing global economic landscape, no government, left or right, can really do business without Korean companies. So for example, we have 5 national economic, associations. The biggest one is the Federation of Korean Industries. In a previous progressive government, for whatever reason, the head of that organization was not invited to any important event for political reasons. But today, even under a progressive government, the FKI is one of the best friends of the government. And why? Because the president realizes he cannot do business for the ROK outside of the Korean borders without Korean companies. And that, I think, is something that is a net positive for the Koreans going into the next 5-10 years.
Jane, you're based in Washington, D.C. I'm curious, so Stanford is physically and metaphysically distant in many ways from Washington, D.C. I know you talk with folks from the embassies, other policy experts. What are you hearing as far as assessments go of whether it's self-assessments by countries in the region or assessments by third parties of how countries, whether Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, how they're navigating this new geopolitical environment?
That's a good question. I think that what we're hearing at the moment is that the sort of the overriding thing that everyone knows is that it's just uncertain. And I think that the sort of the unpredictability, the uncertainty, that nobody knows what's happening tomorrow, I think is the sort of overriding issue at the moment in the trade policy space. And that makes it very difficult, for businesses, and it makes it difficult for governments as well. So I think we often say that, people who say, oh, this is what's going to happen, well, actually nobody knows. Well, there's only one person who knows, President Trump. So I think that overriding sense of uncertainty is really challenging for everyone at the moment. And that's something that's probably not going to change much. But I think in terms of some things that are positive, I did just want to pick up on something that Suzuki-san had mentioned as well, which is in the critical minerals space, something that we've seen just some developments over the last little while, is that back when this administration released its America First trade policy, one of the things that was included in there was the idea of plurilateral sectoral agreements. And we haven't heard much about that since then, as they've been focused on other things. But the fact that these critical mineral agreements are now being concluded with several of the US's partners, and interestingly in the US-Japan one, for example, there is even specific reference to working with international partners on some of those provisions. We've heard recently a few comments from Secretary Bessent as well, that we need to work with allies and partners in this space. So I think maybe that is one of the sort of hopeful areas now, is that perhaps the US is seeing now that it does need to work with its partners in this sort of critical minerals area, and maybe that could even extend to working with more than one partner, so working in that kind of plurilateral space. We saw recently the G7, for example, announced its Critical Mineral Production Alliance, I think it was called. So we are starting to see a bit more of a movement, more towards recognition of the value of allies and partners, what might be possible. And then I guess the question is, could that then even flow into other areas? Are there other sectors where the US might be willing to work with its allies and partners and conclude some sort of agreement, some sort of cooperation? I'm not thinking of traditional free trade agreements here, but maybe something which is in this new era where we are going to be working with partners, working together in particular sectors. And I wonder if that's something, so I think in Washington that is something that maybe people are feeling a little bit more positive about, that maybe that is a direction that we might be able to go in.
Speaking of sectors, AI is obviously a big part, growing part of countries' economic security thinking. We've heard over the course of the day, different countries have different conceptions of what AI sovereignty means. There's not really a single shared definition. To some countries it may mean primarily data sovereignty. To other countries it may mean having models that are tuned to local conditions. I think it's fair to say, and this is true, not just for East Asian countries, but for the United States and China as well, full self-sufficiency across the AI stack it's not economically feasible, right? So there's going to be some degree of global integration of supply chains within the AI ecosystem. Maybe it's bifurcated between a US-led ecosystem and a China-led ecosystem, maybe not, but there will be lots of cross-border linkages in the supply chain, which raises the question, from an economic security perspective, how, and maybe I'll start with you, Kazuto, how much of Japan's thinking about AI, diffusion and innovation is influenced by the economic security debate within Japan?
Well, definitely, there is a significant impact on the economic security discussions and concerns reflected on the Japan AI diffusion rules and Japan, AI guidelines. And it is true from a Japanese point of view that AI cannot be done by one country, and as I said in the previous panel, that the Japan sees the AI in sort of a different layers, 4 layers. One is the basic infrastructure, such as the data center, the submarine cable, etc. So this is where the Japanese economic security lies most. Especially Japan has a competitiveness in the submarine cable. And then we have the questions of the semiconductor. This is where Japan invests more to build our own resilience and autonomous capabilities, which is building up a company like Rapidus. And then we have the AI algorithm, the foundational models. So this layer is pretty much dominant by the United States and China. So we are not practically focusing on this, but for the applications, this is where you have the most added values there. So this is the things that Japan is regarding as a competitive domain. So this is outside of this economic security. This is more market-oriented, market-driven sector. So economic security goes to the foundation, for, the fundamentals of the AI, which is the more physical
enablers. Yeah.
Physical core enablers, and that's where the economic security concerns focus most, and the rest is seen more competitive and the market-oriented edge.
From a South Korean perspective, Andy, I think if you look at what the President Lee Jae-myung said on the AI or the need for AI superhighway, he was also referring to the original highway that late President Park Chung-hee made in 1970. So he deliberately made that connection between the earlier miracle on the Han River and the second miracle that he wants to lead in the AI superhighway. And is that going to be possible? We'll have to wait and see. But again, if the Koreans are going to become major players in the AI front, you can only do that with partnership between NVIDIA and the other companies, or even with the Japanese companies. So when you had that recent meeting in Seoul, as we call the chimek, or fried chicken and beer, it was a really big media moment because you had NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, and then the chairman of Hyundai Motor and Lee Jae-yong from Samsung, all getting together for a beef type of chicken and beer. But they talked about business, which was we need Samsung and Hyundai to help boost NVIDIA, and vice versa. So that's the only way that I think that we can go. For the South Koreans, there's one more added concern, and I think this is the same thing for our Japanese friends. If the AI is used for defense purposes, as are the Chinese, then that is a huge worry for the Koreans and our Japanese friends. If you have a PLA that is both dominant in manpower and combat forces and drones and ISR capabilities, that is a huge worry and the gap that must be filled. And the only way that that defense gap can be filled with AI is with trusted partners, i.e. with America.
And
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I have to leave. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and
we'll keep going. But we wish you well. Going. Safe travels.
Okay.
Thank you.
I want to stay on this theme, Chung-Min, of
Andy, do you want to move over here? So
you know what? I might do that. In the spirit of
make it a bit more intimate.
Earlier in the conversation, we talked about this deepening, embeddedness of security within trade, and the Biden administration, if you talk to the leaders behind the export controls and the ones who went out and delivered the message to friends and allies as to why we were pursuing these export controls on chips and equipment, it was rooted in national security, right? It was, look, it's not about holding China back technologically. It's about preventing the PLA from accessing the most cutting-edge American technology that they might then use in their military equipment, which could be used against American servicemen and women, right? That was the argument. Yeah. But again, we've seen this blurring between the security and the economic equities, call them. In Korea, does the argument rooted in national security for these kinds of export controls, is the persuasiveness still there?
That's a great question. It's probably outside my domain of expertise, and I'm sure Jane has a better answer than I do. But I think the Korean national security establishment is now waking up to the fact that if our adversaries, i.e. North Korea, especially China, are using economic tools to weaponize against us, then we have to respond in some shape or form. We are not going to respond militarily because that will lead to conflict and maybe even war. So if we're going to fight an economic war with the Chinese, then we need what? We need the EU and the Americans and the Japanese with us. You cannot fight this war on your own. And that's something that I think the Korean national security I guess, apparatus is now beginning to understand. I'll just give you one example. The current National Security Advisor, who is a lifelong diplomat and served as ambassador to Russia, a very good guy, he spends, I would argue, maybe even more than half his time on economic security, on thinking about how will trade and tariffs impact South Korea's national defense posture. And that is something that no national security advisor before him really had to consider. And so in the president's office, right below him, you have 3 deputy national security advisors. One fellow is designated with the title of Deputy NSC Advisor for Technology. And one is Deputy National Security Advisor for Economic Affairs, and the other is for Defense and Security. So that just tells you that even within that small presidential office, you have a breakdown that is really focusing on economic security. And this term was, Suzuki-san may have alluded to this, the term economic security came into the American lexicon in the early 80s when my very good friend Yoichi Funabashi was a visiting scholar at the Kennedy School. And he was the first who said, in the 80s and 90s and beyond, economic security is going to be king. And he was telling me not too long ago in Singapore that when he first coined this term, his American counterparts, including the late Professor Joe Nye and others, simply did not really understand what he meant. But of course, that is now the most oft-used term in describing the new national security paradigm that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
View on export controls. Does the argument from U.S. policymakers for decades for export controls has been rooted in some national security concern, and that carries a certain amount of normative weight with interlocutors. But when the line between security and trade is blurred, and then it becomes something that is negotiable, whereas before you don't negotiate security. How does this shift, this blurring of security and economics affect the persuasiveness of American diplomacy, American advocacy for tough export controls?
Yeah, I think that that the US has always been pretty persuasive, I think, in the arguments that it's made around these sorts of issues, and I think it's the way that it has engaged with its partners has always been really important as well. And my only concern really is that this year, through the other things that it has been pursuing, it's changed the way that it has engaged with its allies and partners. So what we are seeing is that, for example, on the retaliatory the reciprocal tariffs, I beg your pardon, there was definitely a sense that allies and partners were actually treated the same as adversaries. So I feel like it's really important, not just the message that the US is bringing, but also the way that it brings that message as well. And I feel like this year, that has changed a little bit. But in terms of its persuasive nature, I definitely, agree that what's happening is that the wake-up call, I guess, is happening, in other countries, and that they are beginning to see that. And both Suzuki-san and Chung-Min have both referred to, the economic coercion that Korea and Japan, have faced in the past, and that served as a wake-up call, for them, and the need to actually, have systems and develop resilience and work with partners, and so those individual actions served as a wake-up call. But I do think that is definitely spreading to other countries now, and so I remember that the EU used to, have kind of a different view on China as well, and that's starting to move as well. And I remember when I was in New Zealand, when, for example, Australia faced significant economic coercion from China, that also has an impact on New Zealand as well, and and serves as a wake-up call to others in the region. So I think that there is definitely an element of persuasion that's coming from the US, and the need for these certain actions, for example, like in export controls. But I think just want to underline the importance of the way that message is carried out as well is also really important in the region.
Andy, traditionally, if you look at export controls, the Korean government, for example, was focusing primarily on the potential transfer of technologies for military purposes. So if you had the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Koreans from the onset were part of that regime. And so we did not want to export whatever technologies we had that could be used for, precarious purposes. The problem now, I think, is the proliferation of dual-use technologies. So if you look at drones or robotics or unmanned systems, and the list goes on throughout the supply chain, these dual-use technologies can be weaponized overnight. So I'll just give you one example. One Korean company is working on a new type of infrared radar, and they've come very close to basically making this into the market. And they're basically going to detect, for example, mines and other types of bad things. And yet they're concerned because they are a purely commercial company, but it obviously has, critical military and strategic implications. So they're worried about whether they will be under sanctions if this goes to market. So these are the types of issues that even these small SMEs did not have to really think about before, but with the proliferation of dual-use technologies, this is becoming one of their big concerns. Yeah.
And can I just add to that one thing I think is interesting about the dual-use technologies is who actually gets to make the decision, about whether this, what is the end use actually going to be, and what is the role of government in regulating that? Because is it the company who has to do those investigations, or is it the government that takes that responsibility? Like, who should the onus be on as well, I think is really important. And for small and medium-sized businesses, you're really trying to support them and help them to grow and to innovate. But if they, if they're small, but they still have to do all these investigations and try and work out where this product might end up, it also can be quite a big burden as well. So I think getting that balance right as well is also important.
Jane, a former national security advisor in Korea who was heavily involved in Chorus FTA was telling me that one silicon chip, one semiconductor in Korea made by Samsung, he had to trace, for example, the supply chain. I think it was something like 200 odd companies worldwide. So if even one of those companies are under the US government radar for export controls, then it basically upsets the entire supply chain. So that's something that I think, again, companies are now just waking up. It's not the final product that is important as it is, it's the entire supply chain, and even one small blip in the supply chain could destroy your business.
Yeah, it's last month, the Bureau of Industry and Security, the organization within the Commerce Department that administers and develops the dual-use export control regime for the United States, issued a rule that it's called the Foreign Affiliates Rule for export control wonks out there, that basically says an exporter is strictly liable.
You mean worldwide?
Yeah.
Not just American.
Well, because
Right,
as long as it's American, it's still subject to U.S. export control rules for the most part. If an entity is on the entity list,
right,
and it has affiliates that are more than 50% owned, if the export prohibited item gets to that affiliate, there's strict liability on the part of the exporter for a violation of U.S. export control. That's new. It's a big deal. It was also issued right before the shutdown, so there's a lot of scrambling to understand what the rule means, and not a whole lot of people in government around to answer questions about it. But it's a big deal, and it's on the one hand, right? I mean, we want, as I'm a national security wonk,
right,
at heart, I want participants in the economy to exercise due diligence in how they conduct their affairs and not sell bad stuff to bad people and bad organizations. But on the other hand, the point there is a compliance burden, and it's a hard balance to get right because maybe the answer is for BIS to hire more investigators and agents, right? We could do that. That's really expensive. We could get hand waving and say, oh, maybe AI will help fix that. You know,
Right.
that's a possibility, right? I want to open the conversation up to questions from you all in the 15 minutes or so that we have left. So any questions for our panelists? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This was really, really great. I wanted to piggyback on the notion that like a Samsung chip might have 200 different companies and entities that it goes through. I'm wondering what the road was to that 200. Okay. Because in my understanding, and maybe this is incorrect, I'm not an expert in this, I have heard that there's...
Nor am I.
Okay, great. That there was a lot of subcontracting, and
right.
subcontracting upon the subcontractors,
right.
as a lot of firms that used to do things in-house sort of hollowed themselves out in favor of IP and very fine points of specialization. Do you think that part of the difficulties might actually be to restore more in-house capabilities, to regain a lot of those subcontractors, and specialize in a way that you can just have maybe 30 companies do what is now 200? Thank you very much.
I think that's a great question, and I'm sure Jane has a better answer than I do, or I'm sure Andy does, but in my own non-specialist way, I would answer it this way. This is precisely the reason why many Korean companies are working towards virtual integration. So you want to make sure that your suppliers are not only worthy and trustworthy, but that you can depend on them to, whether it's rare earth minerals or whatever, to basically deliver it fairly quickly without any, snafu. But vertical integration also has a risk because it will cost you tons of money. Mm-hmm. If you want everything from ISR all the way down to unmanned sea platforms, can you think about all of the supply chain that you need to control, and who will oversee all of that control? So this is why companies outsource it, because you basically fire and forget, and you hope that your suppliers will come back. That was pre-COVID and pre-US-China trade wars and pre-Trump too, so that now companies realize, yes, we have to streamline our global supply chain, but there's a limit. You cannot do everything on your own. And so that's a dilemma. Now, big companies, the chaebols, have the wherewithal to do some of that. But Andy, it's the SMEs who really have difficulty because they don't have the money to go out and search for other suppliers. If they have one supplier from Mexico, well, that's the supplier they're going to go with. But they cannot go out and look at Ecuador or Switzerland or Morocco, as the case may be, because they just don't have that bandwidth in capital, manpower, or time.
I would just add, I just wonder if your question actually brings us right back to the beginning, which is friendshoring. So if we are going to have a lot of different companies that are involved, what sort of companies are we looking for? Well, hopefully we're looking to be engaging with companies from friendshoring countries, so those countries that we are like-minded with, that we can trust them. And I think that was one of the sort of key words we talked about earlier, was the importance of trust. So it's not only between countries, it's between companies as well.
Other questions?
If I can just pick up on what Jane said, I have never owned a Bitcoin in my entire life, and I won't own a Bitcoin or anything that comes close to it. But I think the new Bitcoin in this new age is trust. And without trust, and defining trust is very difficult, Andy. So let me ask you a question. Mm-hmm. You're the moderator, but let me put you in a hot spot. How would you define trust in this day and age, both for national security reasons and for global supply chain reasons? Because without trust, you're not going to have basically joint collaboration. The Japanese want to build Generation 6 fighter aircraft with the UK and the Italians. Why? There's a huge level of trust. AUKUS, if it ever does happen, you have a deep surplus of trust between the Aussies, the Brits, and the Americans. So again, I would argue, if trust is the new Bitcoin, how would you define trust, and how do we leverage amongst like-minded states our trust coin?
So a colloquial definition of trust is someone who will keep their word, right? Okay. but I don't think that's enough here, right?
Right.
Because, you know, I could promise to be malicious, and I mean, I'm trust, you know, so, and so there's sort of an alignment of interests that I think you have to overlay on top of the you know, ability to keep one's word, right? Because that's sort of ultimately why the counterpart is trustworthy, because you have your interests are aligned in some fundamental way, and you know, that's what makes the volatility in the current you know, geopolitical landscape, especially with technology, but more broadly, so difficult to manage. I mean, we've heard, I think, you know, Jay and others have made this point about the uncertainty, right, being a major factor in governments, you know, assessment of how to react to this administration and other geopolitical developments. It's a big factor for companies as they think about whether, where, and when to invest. So that's to me, it comes down to an alignment of interest.
You know, I was talking to a bunch of Korean entrepreneurs in the startup space, focusing on defense issues. It was really interesting. Their main concern was about the legal definitions of trust. So they said, if we're going to go into business with company X in Switzerland, there's no problem because legally we have no issues. We trust the Swiss 100%. But he said, can we do the same with the US or other countries? And so in their mindset, legal issues, Jane, it's going to be a huge barometer whether they can really trust and work with either a company or a government. So you know, that's what these guys were telling me, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. So from their perspective, yes, you know, policy, supply chain, all that matters, but at the end of the day, they said they're zeroing in on compliance issues and what the legal framework is. And as long as they're okay with that, then they're going to do business. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah. Please. Microphone will come.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I would like to ask one question to Mr. Lee. So Suzuki-san earlier mentioned that the Korea has more like closer relationship between like the government and industries, and then like, and of course, like I think it is really important to like you know, have a closer relationships between the industries and government when thinking about, you know, good economic security policy. So I would like to ask if you have if you know some like relationships, like good relationships, like cooperation between the government and industries. I'm from Japan, and maybe like Japan have to learn something about Korea. Thank you.
No, you know, as you know, the Koreans learned our economic trade policy from the Japanese from the 1960s. So as the Japanese recovered after the war, and after we normalized relations with Japan in 1965, the export-led growth model was followed by Korea because of the Japanese example. You know, by the '64 Tokyo Olympics, Japan was already rising up. And so we emulated what the Japanese did. So learning is always a two-way street. I think the real challenge here is you cannot demonize corporations. However, these corporations are becoming so powerful that they're becoming even more powerful than governments in many respects. You know, the total market cap, as I was saying yesterday, of NVIDIA is $5 trillion. The GDP of Germany is $4.7 trillion. So one company, at least on paper, has more money than Germany. So as a result, unless we are able to work with corporations, but also make sure there are safeguards and guardrails so that they don't become too powerful, we will be in deep trouble. Now, how do we do that? I simply do not know. I'm sure Jane has a better answer as a lawyer, but seriously, it's a catch-22. You must work with huge tech companies. Why? Because of the AI race. But if they become so powerful, why will they listen to you? And so this is a catch-22 that I think no government has really figured out, but I'll defer to my dear friend who's based in Washington, working on the 8th floor of our building.
Yeah, no, I don't have any answers for that either. But what I do think is that the government needs to give enough attention to this issue. I think that's one of the things, and that sort of came across in our discussions yesterday, is that, you know, it's really hard for governments to keep up with the technological changes, but they really need to sort of keep trying. And I just want to sort of make that point that, you know, businesses are moving ahead at such a fast rate. You know, the technological advances are just incredible these days. And governments, you know, they have bureaucracies for a reason, but that can also mean that it slows things down. So I think it's just really important that the governments are really engaged in this and thinking about, you know, the governance and what's actually needed, as you say, like not just domestically, but also the international governance as well. And I don't think we've talked about it too much today, but what should be out there, you know, to actually help the governance of this. We talked a lot about, you know, who's going to win the AI race and how can we control the companies and things. But how can countries also work together and form some sort of governance regime and think about what the rules that could be, that could apply to not just them or not just the big players, but actually to everyone as well. Because I think people did mention it in some of the earlier sessions today, the importance of equity in all of this as well, and making sure that, you know, the global south is not missing out, and those sorts of things as well. And I think that having, you know, effective governance arrangements can be really helpful in that regard as well.
You know, I think the younger generation in Japan, for example, especially in the business community, must be much more proactive. You know, it's not enough to make money in Japan. In Israel, for example, almost all startups, they go to the US because the domestic market is too small. But if Japan wants to be a leader in AI and technologies, you know, this is a country where 32 Nobel Prizes have been given. It's a remarkable number, right? Japan has enormous science and technology capabilities. But I just think that going forward, the younger entrepreneurs in Japan must really be able to be the leaders in the future. And so, yes, you have to work with JETRO and other government entities, but it is a private sector that must be much more globalized if Japan is to become a critical leader in the AI front, as I believe she has the ability to do so.
Other questions? Good.
Hi, my name is Chung-Min. I'm a researcher at the Korean Consulate. I have one very simple question, maybe. It's on the economic security front, Korea is tightening links with the United States in advanced technology, supply chains, and semiconductors. And could you advise what are the key policy or diplomatic leverage Seoul should use to continue the strengthening the cooperation while maintaining the competitiveness of the, you know, domestic industry?
You want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll take a quick shot. So, you know, I think Korea needs markets, right? And that means striking a balance between, you know, asserting its interests with the United States, with China, while not picking fights it can't win, or at least has a good chance of losing. Which is to say, it needs to be shrewd, right? That's not so much a policy instrument as it is, you know, an asset, you know, in leaders' minds and you know, developed through experience and I think you know, Korea has you know, democratic neighbors in Japan and Taiwan. I think there are opportunities to continue to build closer relationships across different parts. Thinking about AI specifically, across different parts of the AI stack. I'd like to see, you know, the engagement that began 2 years ago between Japan and Korea to just continue to develop and grow. I'm not a specialist in Korea's economy, so I can't be more specific than those generalities, but that's what comes to my mind off the top.
That's a great question, so thank you for your question. I think if I think about especially the semiconductor industry, and Samsung is of course one of the major companies in Korea and in the world in that sector, it's very interesting that at the height of the tension between iPhone, Apple, and Samsung, people don't know this, but it was Samsung that really supported iPhone in terms of their glass panels. So even though they were fighting a vicious war between iPhone and Samsung, they were still collaborating. And that, I think, to me, typifies the world we live in. So you compete, you collaborate, and you cooperate, all at the same time. And companies, need that flexibility. I would argue that in the next, 10, 20 years, my dream is for Korea to create 100 new Samsungs. It may not be as big. If you look at the market cap of the top 100 companies in South Korea, it's about $20 trillion. Versus, for example, the market cap of NVIDIA itself is just 5 trillion. I meant 1.8 trillion. So the market cap of Korean companies is still very, very low compared to just one US company. Or it could be other companies in the US as well. So in the next 5-10 years, if the Korean AI superhighway actually results in a second Miracle on the Han River, the real index for me is whether we can have 100 new Samsungs. And finally, what I would like to say is, Chairman Cho Tae-won of SK is one of the most, thinking out of the box business leaders. His vision is not just for Korea and Japan to create and sign an FTA. He wants to have these two economies like a small EU. So his vision is we can no longer export ourselves out of growth. That day is gone. And the only way that the Koreans can preserve their economic well-being and growth is to work really tightly with the Japanese into a common market. Will this happen in my lifetime? Who knows? But at least this is a vision that has legs.
Well, we're at time. I want to first off thank the terrific panelists for sharing their insights and their expertise with us. I learned a lot from this panel, as I did with the other 3 panels. Just to bring us home for the day, I'll share a few reflections with you all. I think it's pretty evident that we're in early days technologically, but also geopolitically when it comes to the geopolitics of technology in East Asia and beyond. You observe the rapid pace of innovation in the AI ecosystem. It's dizzying. But the pace of geopolitical change, entropy is probably a better word than change. So I don't think we know what I don't think it's stabilized enough to observe a steady state yet. So call it entropy. We're barely into it, and I don't think that the tariff episode will end anytime soon. Obviously, U.S.-China competition isn't going away anytime soon, and so it's early days across both the technological and geopolitical front. Another observation is, this has always been, I think, true, but it's become really, I think, surfaced in our discussion today is the notion that industry is an essential actor in international affairs. In academia, IR theorists often, treat corporate behavior as kind of epiphenomenal, right? It's sort of captured through other mechanisms of influence, but I think that's, I'm not an IR theorist, but I don't find that view of the world persuasive. I think it's pretty clear that industry, across the AI stack and even in other domains is a key actor in international affairs. And this isn't necessarily a new development, right? You think back to the days of the India companies, Dutch and British East India companies, the Hudson's Bay company that ran Canada for 200 years, Standard Oil, United Fruit, right? So there, in history, there are examples of companies acting like nation states, having comparable resources, comparable influence. This feels different, though. We have several major United Fruit-like companies operating at once globally, and that's a different paradigm. So, and the last point I'll close with is, again, an observation. U.S. alliances have bent. I mean, they've been under strain. Primarily because of the tariff, conflict over the last 10 months, but those relations aren't broken yet. I don't know how much flex is in the relationship. I hope there's more, because I'm not especially optimistic that we're sort of at peak conflict. But I still remain an optimist in the ability of the U.S. and its alliances to weather this moment. I want to thank the wonderful team that helped put this event together: Connor Chapman, Ali Hahn, Eliana Pradas, Gabby Ermani, Tracy Hines, Malou Van Dronen Griesman, and the awesome Bechtel events team. I want to thank all the panelists, many of whom came from very far away to join us. Thank you all. And last but not least, I want to thank the Korea Foundation for their wonderful support for this conference and the ones before it. And thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks.